For decades, NATO was built on a simple promise: allies do not threaten each other's territory. And yet today, that promise is quietly breaking. Not in Eastern Europe, not in the Middle East, but in the Arctic, over Greenland, a frozen island, 56,000 people, and suddenly the focus of the most powerful man on earth. Donald Trump says the United States needs Greenland for national security. Not wants, needs. He speaks of Russian and Chinese ships moving through Arctic waters. His advisors discuss buying the island. Others suggest that, if necessary, force could be used. This is not a misunderstanding. It is a signal, because when a NATO leader questions the sovereignty of another NATO member's territory, something fundamental has shifted. If you think this is just Trump being Trump, stay with me, because Greenland is not the story. The real story is what happens to alliances when power starts rewriting the rules, and why this island suddenly sits at the center of it all. At first glance, this debate can sound exaggerated. After all, Greenland is remote, sparsely populated, and largely covered in ice. But that view misses the point. The question is not whether Greenland is valuable in isolation. The question is why it has become urgent and why now. Greenland sits at the intersection of three forces, reshaping global politics: great power competition, climate change, and the future of military alliances. As Arctic ice melts, new sea routes are opening. Regions once protected by nature are becoming accessible, navigable, and strategically exposed. At the same time, the United States sees Russia and China expanding their presence in the Arctic commercially, politically, and militarily. Trump frames this as a security necessity, not an expansion, not an ambition, a requirement. Denmark, meanwhile, sees something very different: a challenge to sovereignty and to the rules that bind NATO together. Greenland's leaders see something else entirely, a future that must be decided by Greenlanders themselves. So before we talk about threats or intentions, we need to understand how this island ended up here in the first place. Because Greenland's status was never accidental, and its history explains everything that comes next. To understand why Greenland sits at the center of this storm, we have to go back far before Donald Trump, far before NATO, even before the Cold War. For nearly 300 years, Greenland has been controlled by Denmark, not because it was powerful, but because, for a long time, no one else wanted it. The island was poor, isolated, and brutally difficult to live on. For much of the 20th century, Greenland functioned as a colony, cut off from the world and dependent on Copenhagen. Everything changed during World War II. When Nazi Germany occupied Denmark, the United States moved quickly. American forces landed in Greenland, built airfields and radio stations, and transformed the island into a strategic outpost almost overnight. After the war, the Americans never fully left. The Pituffik Space Base, once Thule Air Base, became a permanent feature of U.S. defense planning. In 1951, Denmark signed a defense agreement granting Washington a major role in protecting the island. Greenland later gained home rule. Its people took control of most domestic affairs. But foreign policy and defense remained in Danish hands. So Greenland became something unusual, not fully sovereign, not fully dependent, a territory shaped as much by geography as by history. And that fragile balance is exactly what makes today's confrontation so dangerous. Then came the moment when quiet tension turned into open rupture. In 2019, Donald Trump made an offer that stunned Europe. He proposed buying Greenland, not leasing it, not negotiating expanded access, buying it. Denmark said no. Greenland said no. The idea was dismissed as absurd, but it did not disappear. When Trump returned to the White House in January 2025, Greenland returned with him. This time, the language was sharper. The urgency was greater. Trump publicly insisted the island was essential to American security. His allies echoed the message, warning that Russian and Chinese ships were increasingly present in Arctic waters. Then the rhetoric escalated. The White House confirmed that multiple options were being discussed to acquire Greenland, including the possible use of the US military. A senior aide dismissed resistance outright, saying no one would fight the United States over the island's future. Suddenly, what had once sounded like bravado felt like policy. This was the first real crisis, not because an invasion was imminent, but because, for the first time, a NATO power openly questioned the sovereignty of territory protected by another NATO member. And once that line is crossed, it becomes very hard to draw it again. What makes this moment so unsettling is not the rhetoric, it's the logic behind it. Trump's argument follows a familiar pattern in great power politics. Security first, rules later. Greenland sits astride the Arctic. It lies along key air and sea routes linking North America, Europe, and Asia. As ice retreats, those routes matter more, not less. From Washington's perspective, influence delayed is influence lost. If Russia and China expand their presence, the United States believes it must move faster, harder, and more decisively. This is where the system begins to reveal itself. The US already operates a major military base on Greenland. It already has defense agreements with Denmark. But in Trump's worldview, access is not the same as control. Control eliminates uncertainty. It removes negotiation. It guarantees permanence. That is the hidden mechanism at work. Security is being redefined not as cooperation, but as ownership. And once security is framed this way, alliances stop being partnerships. They become obstacles. Denmark sees a treaty system built on trust. Trump sees a vulnerability. Greenland's leaders see a future shaped by consent. Trump's circle sees a strategic asset sitting in the wrong hands. These are not just different opinions. They are different definitions of order. And when systems collide like this, the next crisis is never far behind. Then came the second escalation, quieter but far more dangerous. This time, it wasn't just words. High-level visits followed. American officials arrived in Greenland, questioning Denmark's ability to protect the territory. The message was unmistakable. Washington no longer trusted the status quo. When the US Vice President stood on Greenlandic soil and accused Denmark of underinvesting in defense, it crossed a line. Not legally. Politically, later, the appointment of a special US envoy to Greenland sent an even stronger signal. This was no longer a passing idea. It was being institutionalized. By early 2026, Greenland's Prime Minister responded with rare public anger. No more pressure, no more insinuations, no more fantasies of annexation. That reaction matters, because crises are not defined only by tanks or troops. They are defined by perception, and in Copenhagen, Nuuk, and across Europe, the perception hardened. The United States was no longer acting like an ally, it was acting like a claimant. Inside NATO, that changes calculations. Trust erodes quietly. Coordination slows. Every reassurance now carries doubt. This was the second crisis, not explosive, but corrosive. And its effects would not be felt first in ministries or summits. They would be felt by ordinary people. If you live in Greenland, this debate doesn't feel abstract. It feels personal. You hear powerful leaders discuss your home as if it were empty space, a location, a buffer, a strategic asset. But you live there. You fish those waters. You raise families along that coast. Your identity is tied not to Washington or Copenhagen, but to the land itself. Most Greenlanders support independence from Denmark. But that does not mean trading one distant authority for another. Polls and public voices make that clear. When Trump talks about buying Greenland, many hear something chilling. Not partnership, possession. One local leader called it dangerous. Another said it felt like being treated as a product that could be purchased. And this is where geopolitics collides with dignity, because security doctrines rarely ask how they feel to the people living inside them. They talk about stability. They talk about deterrence. They rarely talk about consent. If you believe democracy matters not just at home, but everywhere. This is the moment to pay attention. Because when great powers stop listening to small societies, history tells us what comes next. And the consequences don't stop at Greenland's shores. What happens in Greenland does not stay in Greenland. Because this island sits inside a much larger system, NATO. Greenland itself is not a NATO member. But through Denmark, it is part of the alliance's northern shield. That shield is built on trust, the idea that allies respect each other's sovereignty while coordinating their defense. Trump's pressure fractures that assumption. If a leading NATO power signals it might override an ally's territorial integrity for security reasons, every smaller member starts asking the same question: are the rules still real? Denmark has already warned that any attempt to take Greenland would end the transatlantic alliance as it exists today. Other European leaders have echoed that concern, publicly affirming that Greenland belongs to its people and that decisions about its future cannot be imposed. Meanwhile, Russia and China are watching closely, not because they need to intervene, but because alliance tension is an opportunity. A divided NATO is slower, more cautious, less credible, and credibility, once lost, is hard to rebuild. So Greenland becomes more than an island. It becomes a signal to allies, to rivals, and to the world about whether power still operates within rules, or whether rules now bend to power. That signal will shape global politics long after this crisis fades. So where does this lead? There are three possible futures, and each one reveals something uncomfortable about the world we are entering. The first is restraint. The United States pulls back from coercive rhetoric. Greenland's status remains unchanged. Dialogue replaces pressure. NATO absorbs the shock and stabilizes. This is the best outcome, but it requires something rare: self-limitation by power. The second future is ambiguity. No annexation, no purchase, but constant pressure, more visits, more leverage. Greenland becomes a permanent strategic question mark. Alliances survive, but thinner, more transactional, less trusting. The third future is rupture, a serious attempt to force Greenland's status. Denmark resists, NATO fractures. The alliance meant to protect democracy becomes the stage for its erosion. None of these futures are inevitable, but all of them are plausible because they flow from the same source: a world where security is defined by control, where strength is measured by how much you can take, not how much you can restrain yourself from taking. Greenland is not choosing between Denmark and America. It is standing at the edge of a larger choice the world is now facing. And that choice will define the next era of global order. There is a temptation, when listening to this story, to dismiss it as an episode. Another Trump controversy, another headline that will fade. That would be a mistake. Because Greenland is not really about Greenland. It is about whether power still accepts limits. For decades, NATO was more than a military alliance. It was a moral contract built on consent, sovereignty, and trust among democracies. Once those principles are questioned from within, the damage does not stay contained. Greenland's leaders have been clear. Dialogue, yes. Pressure, no. Annexation fantasies, never. And that clarity matters, because the future of global order will not be decided only by great powers pushing outward. It will be decided by whether smaller societies are still allowed to say no and be heard. If you care about democracy, about alliances, about a world where security does not erase dignity, then this story is not distant. It is personal. Follow this issue. Talk about it, question it. Because the next time a border between allies is tested, it may not be in the Arctic.